Hello, friends. This is Carrie Morrison. Welcome to episode 4 of this season of Heartforward Conversations from the Heart. This week, we are going to hear about how a mobile crisis outreach team with the quirky name CAHOOTS has captured the imagination of city managers and police chiefs all over the country. In Trieste, we saw that the local police were the last people you would call to respond to a psychiatric crisis in the community. And that's how it should be. But that is not the case in the United States. Think about it. If we condone a system where a mental health crisis call, be it a suicide threat, erratic behavior, or someone walking into traffic, can only be addressed by a call into 911, which leads to a visit from law enforcement, it sends the very wrong message that mental illness is a crime. In this interview with Adam Climer, you will hear firsthand how the mobile crisis response team works in Eugene, Oregon. He speaks from experience, having rolled with this team for 5 years. Hi, this is Carrie Morrison, and this morning I am just so delighted to be sitting here with Adam Climer, and I will tell you that we are sitting here in person in a studio. This is the first in-person interview I've had for Heartforward podcast since the pandemic began, and Adam, it is just awesome to see you in person.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited. You know, it's interesting that we're able to do this now and feeling honored, I suppose, that I'm the first in-person one. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's so good to see you. And it's been a number of years since we have seen each other. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you left California, went to Oregon, and came back again today. Let's start with a little bit of your origin story, Adam. Who are you? How did you arrive in this space of having such a heart for issues related to homelessness? We did have an opportunity to work together here in Los Angeles on these issues, and then you migrated up to Oregon. So tell us a little bit about your origin story.
Yeah, so I grew up, kind of rural, suburban Oregon with a doctor for a father, a teacher for a mom, and ended up in college in Seattle at a little evangelical school called Seattle Pacific, and had what I could consider a spiritual awakening that was very much centered around this idea that I kind of realized just how, I would say, unempathetic we are as a society and not compassionate. It was a really formative and good time. And I ended up joining a Mennonite church. And, what was interesting about that experience is that everyone in that church had done some kind of year of service or something like that, with various organizations that are organized by the Mennonite church. And so that's how I got connected to DOOR, which is 1 year long live-in community with other young people, sort of internship program.
And DOOR stands for what, and where was that?
Discovering opportunities for outreach and reflection. And then it was in Hollywood, the house is in Hollywood. And my internship, what was at the time called Social Services at Blessed Sacrament, and then it became the Center at Blessed Sacrament. It went through a number of iterations of names and what we did there, even while I was there, which was a really exciting, fun, a little bit traumatizing for a sort of young white kid from the Northwest, just kind of being slammed with the realities of the sort of psychosocial difficulties and experiences of people who are experiencing homelessness in a large urban area. And, kind of right away working there, I became pretty obvious pretty fast that I had a pretty distinct view of the world compared to a lot of other people. So, for example, the first time somebody explained the concept of harm reduction to me, I was floored because I had been of the assumption that that was what everyone believed.
So you need, for this audience, you do need to define what is harm reduction.
So harm reduction is sort of broad-based service delivery philosophy that there are things out there that cause harm, and the goal is not necessarily to get somebody to stop doing those entirely, but rather to find ways. So, for example, the primary one is drug use, but find ways to use or utilize drugs in a way, or have your life oriented in a way that it reduces the harm. So the best example is switching from straight vodka to beer, right? You can still drink, and drinking is fine, but you're not going to drink that stuff that kind of wrecks you so bad. And so I had always just assumed that was just what people would think, but it turns out that's not necessarily the case. And I was pretty surprised to learn that my sort of perspective on things was different. And maybe that's just me being me and assuming that I'm normal, but yeah, it was interesting. So So because of my sort of outlook and perspective, I got connected to Housing Works and Molly Lowry and the things that she did and the things that they did there, because we saw the world very similarly. So then I met my wife working at the center, and we got married, and we were very stressed out about having a baby in a dense urban area like Los Angeles. And so we were like, let's find someplace else to go. Let's find a little quieter, something a little less intense. It's funny I say that because the work I ended up doing was even more intense than the work I did here, which the work I did here was pretty intense. So that kind of gives you a sense of what we were doing. So we looked at Salem because that's kind of where I was from, Salem, Oregon, and there was no jobs working in the homeless services field there. So we looked at, on a whim, I looked at Eugene, and there were like 50 jobs on Craigslist. And I was like, well, this is perfect. Also, Celine, my wife, had never finished her undergrad, and Eugene has the University of Oregon. So we thought, well, this will be nice. You can do your undergraduate degree, and I can work in the homeless services field, and this will be good. So we rolled up there and, had our first son, Jonas, who's almost 7 now. So this was 7 years ago. And I was unemployed for a while, and we're looking for jobs. And I'd go to these interviews for case management jobs and stuff. And I walk in and I'd say, well, I believe in harm reduction. I believe in housing first. I help house people who are experiencing homelessness. Like, this is what I'm about. And they are all very, very intimidated by that. And so sort of like, yeah, we like that too, kind of attitude. I saw this position for this CAHOOTS program, and I read about it. I thought, this is genius, and
do you remember what the job description said?
Yeah, it says must have 2 years or more of experience in a non-traditional mental health setting, which I thought was great. That was like one of the first things that really stuck out to me. And I thought, well, I definitely have that. That's definitely what I've got. And stuff like respond to people on the street and assist people who are experiencing suicidal ideation and transport people and all that kind of stuff, which I had done with Housing Work, done a lot of transporting people around. And so I thought, this is perfect. So I ended up working really hard to get an interview there. I pestered the program coordinator, every day, just like, hey, do you need anything more from me? I went out and got re-up my CPR certification and all that kind of stuff. Was really interested in this job. So I go in and at the interview, I tell them who I am. And they were the first ones that were just like, yes, this is great. Like, this is perfect. They're like, even if we don't hire you for CAHOOTS, we would love for you to participate in other parts of our agency because everything you're saying is what we stand for. So I was like, okay, this is great.
And so I'm going to pause for a minute. For those who don't know, we are going to talk about this at greater length in a moment. Yeah. But what is CAHOOTS? Again, just in a nutshell.
Oh, yeah. We'll totally get there. CAHOOTS is, for a nutshell, it's a non-emergency first response to residents who are experiencing some kind of crisis. And the crisis usually has to relate to mental health, substance use, or homelessness related issues, or all three. It really it runs the gamut from just people they're recently homeless and they don't really know what to do or where to go. So you go out and you take them to the drop-in center and you sort of explain different stuff, to a extremely wealthy young teenager who's feeling suicidal. And you're going to those types of things and you're just figuring out how to help them, basically. So I got onto the CAHOOTS team and I worked there for 5 years. And in the middle of that, I got my EMT license. So on the CAHOOTS team, everyone's paired. It works in teams of 2 with one person who's a crisis intervention worker and one person who's an EMT. And so I did that. Then Celine got accepted to the MFA program at UC Riverside. And so we were like, we'll go back to California because it's a really awesome thing and it's a fully funded master's program. You can't argue with that. So we came back. I got a job at the county working with CBEST. I don't know if you're familiar with CBEST, but it's like the Benefits Entitlement Services team. And then last June, July, with all the things going on, I realized, okay, people are going to want CAHOOTS style programs. They just are, this is it. It just felt different this time. So I think that cities really are going to make changes here. And so Whitebird and I collaborated for a little while on some consulting work. And then I just kind of stepped out on my own, got a couple contracts. And now I'm doing consulting full time to help cities develop CAHOOTS style programs. And so we can get a little more into what CAHOOTS is.
Yeah, I do want you to, I did a little tiny bit of research so I could ask some intelligent questions of you, Ben Adam. But I think
great questions.
What would be good for our listeners to understand is How did CAHOOTS originate?
Yeah.
I was kind of surprised to see that it's been around for so long. What is the Whitebird Clinic? Why is Eugene such a hotbed of innovation? What's kind of the cultural impetus for that? So paint a picture of the origins of CAHOOTS and why it's flourished up there.
Okay, so it's interesting because CAHOOTS started in 1989, and basically what happened was the city was kind of planning. They realized that they had a ratio of police officer to citizens that was below the national advised amount. And so they said, we're going to hire 2 new police officers. And because it's Eugene, which is a very sort of like hippie town, said, unless somebody's got like a different idea. At the time, 911 system was very new. And I think it's hard because I think especially my generation, millennials and stuff, we just never known life without 911. But at the time, it was very new. So the Whitebird Clinic had been operating this walk-in and phone line crisis clinic for 20 years at that point. They'd been doing it since 1969. They said, well, we have these times where people call and we want to see them in person. We can't because we just don't have a mobile team. And they have such bad mental health issues or they don't have the finances to get to us. So they said, we think it'd be really cool if we could send our crisis clinic, crisis assistants, out on the streets. So that's how you get the acronym for CAHOOTS. Crisis assistants helping out on the streets, because they were in a clinic and then they moved out onto the streets. They were also a bunch of hippies, so they thought it was a really funny name. They thought it was hilarious that they were in cahoots with the cops. They just thought that was really clever. And they said, wouldn't it be cool if we could take that team and we could put them on the radios the same way the police and the fire department are? I thought, okay. And so, like I said, like at the time, this is all pretty new stuff. So nowadays, I think we have this real strong sense of like who's on the radio, what 911 is and what non-emergency requests are and that kind of stuff. You call in and stuff. But at the time, it was all so fresh that it was like, sure, why not? Let's just do it. So they did that. And they just started sending out these crisis counselors on these calls in lieu of sending out these police officers that they were planning to hire. And then in the late 90s, they were realizing that they were running into so many different circumstances that required some kind of medical professional, that they needed some kind of medical help on the call. So that's why they integrated the EMT onto the van. So they took out one of the crisis counselors, put the EMT on, and that just made their ability to do things pretty much double. Now they can do way more stuff. So now they've gone from just sort of responding to these sort of run-of-the-mill kind of mental health and homeless calls to all sorts of stuff constantly. And then they're doing it so much that in 2011, the city said, we need you more. So then they expanded. And then in 2014, the city of Springfield, the county of Lane County was like, hey, we got this grant from the state. We'd like to do something there, and maybe CAHOOTS can do it in Springfield, which is the next biggest city in the county. So then CAHOOTS expanded into Springfield. Then we went 24 hours, I guess, in 2017, because people were saying, we need this more and more and more. So yeah, that's how I got there. And so the way you get CAHOOTS is the exact same way you get a police officer or a firefighter or a paramedic. You just call the Central Communications Center and you either request CAHOOTS or you sort of describe what you've got going on.
That's so super important.
Yeah.
So you don't call 911.
You could call 911, yeah.
Okay.
You call Central Communications. There's 2 numbers to get Central Communications. There's 911 and there's non-emergency. Yeah. So, they go to the same call takers. The same person answers the phone. And actually, it's little known fact, but people call non-emergency typically more than they call 911. But it's the same people answering the phones. And you can get a police officer, a paramedic, a firefighter, whether you call non-emergency or 911.
So that call center, because I know we're going to talk a little bit about how people are surmising this could be implemented in other cities in the country. That call center has been trained to discern what is a CAHOOTS a response, what is the PD. How would you define that discernment? How do they know? Yeah,
I mean, it's not too tricky. If somebody's calling saying this person is violating some legal statute that I allege that they're violating, then you would probably send the police. And if you call and you say, I saw this person laying on the sidewalk and they didn't look well, then you send the CAHOOTS team. And that's just kind of the basics of it. That's a very basic, rudimentary way of putting it. Or somebody calls and says, like, let's say my spouse has a firearm and they are threatening me with it, probably send the police. But if they say my spouse has a firearm and they're threatening themselves with it, then they send the police and CAHOOTS. And if they call and they say, my spouse doesn't have any firearm, they're not carrying anything or whatever, but they are saying that they want to die by suicide, then it's in CAHOOTS.
Wow. Wow. That is mind blowing how they have perfected that. It's almost beneficial that it's been done in a small city to show what is possible. And so it must take pressure off the paramedics also, because you and I both know we would see people in Hollywood just laying on the street, dehydrated, probably suffering from substance abuse or mental illness. And you would call the paramedic. Paramedic would show up. And multiple times I would see the paramedic prop that person up against a wall and say, do you need help? They would say no, and the paramedic would leave.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We relieve a lot of their stress as well. Yeah. The CAHOOTS team relieves a lot of pressure off EMS, like majorly. I try to always bring that up every time I talk about it, because it's like, look, we put a lot of pressure and a lot of burden on police, fire, and EMS to manage these situations. And I'm going to tell you, paramedics are lifesavers. They're incredible. If you have a heart attack, they can literally bring you back to life. It's incredible. It's amazing. And if they are stuck talking to a person who's dehydrated on the side of the road and just needs some supportive services, they're not going to get to that heart attack as fast. They're going to be maybe a little bit annoyed because they just spent 20 minutes doing something that they weren't really wanting to do. And now they've got to go do this other thing that they feel like they should be doing. And they were busy doing this thing. Now they're frustrated. Now they're not thinking as clearly. And so the goal is to definitely alleviate a lot of that burden off of them. 2 a.m. People are calling on people sleeping on the side of the road at 2 a.m. Well, now you've just woken up those paramedics who you want them rested. You want them doing their best job because you want them to save your life. Definitely a lot off of their plate as well.
So that 24-hour response of CAHOOTS seems very important. I think you said that started in maybe 2011?
It's 2017.
17. Okay, so it's only been a few years, because that's certainly what we see in Los Angeles and many other big cities, that if you do have some kind of a mental health response or some kind of crisis van, sometimes they only work Monday through Friday. The clinics are open Monday through Friday, banker's hours, and now the police and fire take the 24-hour care. What maybe took so long for that to happen even in Eugene, to have that 24-hour response?
Yeah, it was actually a tragedy that happened in Eugene that ended up kind of being the impetus for it. So we elected a mayor who had been the development director at the biggest housing services program. So if you could imagine, if the development director of PATH became the mayor of Los Angeles, that's basically what happened in 2017. And she was, pretty bullish. We need CAHOOTS 24 hours. And so that was nice. And then there was a call that came in at about 2:55 a.m. And at the time, CAHOOTS was going out of service at 3 a.m. That's because they said, there's not that many calls between 3 a.m. and in the mornings for you. So that's when you're going to shut down. So call came in 2:55, young black male having can't remember if it was a psychotic episode or panic attack. Police showed up. Not too friendly to him. His mother said, please stop. They ended up tasing her, tasing him. It was not a great situation. And she was the sibling of the president or the vice president of the local NAACP chapter. They came out hard, swinging hard, saying this is absolutely inappropriate. This is a CAHOOTS call. It should have gone to CAHOOTS, but you don't fund them 24/7. So you need to fund them 24/7 so this kind of stuff won't happen again. That's how it happened.
Wow. So out of tragedy comes the full system.
Yeah. And it's a morality tale, really. And it's a point I try to make to cities that I'm working with, thing. Like, even if there's not very many calls, even if the call volume is really heavy at 6 p.m., let's make sure we have it 24 hours from the start.
This is important how it evolved in Eugene then. I think at the very beginning, you said it started out as a 2-person van and obviously expanded. So to have a 24-hour response, tell us a little bit about what is the response time? What happens if you do have a crush of calls, and how many people now are within the staff realm of the CAHOOTS program?
Yeah. Response time is tricky because, if you look at median response time for a CAHOOTS response, it's rather long. But the reality is that we prioritize calls based on acuity. So, showing up, if somebody's calling from like a staffed service, let's say, where they can sit there and wait, that doesn't need to be like immediate. That kind of call is going to wait for a long time. But if it's a suicidal person who's saying like, I need help now, that gets a pretty quick response. So it really just depends, on what kind of call you're talking about. Some of them get very quick turnarounds and some of them not so much. And then, the city of Springfield, the responses are much quicker because it's a much smaller city.
Well, how many staff now are in that?
I think they're staffed up at about 30 to 35 people, I think. And the staffing for CAHOOTS is interesting because there's kind of two types of staff there. There's people who are full-time and then people who kind of do like one day a week on the side. So the full-time staff are, there's probably about 20 to 25 of them or so, I'd say. And then there's the other folks that just kind of, pick up a day here and there.
So 2-person, you've got the EMT, emergency medical tech, right? And then would you call it a crisis worker? Are these, which you must have started out as?
I started as a crisis worker, yeah.
And is there a role for people with lived experience to be in this position as well?
Well, yeah, and that's interesting too, because I think we have some questions about other cities. There's some other cities like San Diego, their version of it is a 3-person team actually running now, where they have kind of a master's level person, and then they have a lived experience peer support. At CAHOOTS, they don't really care so much about what kind of letters you have behind your name. Like they could give a damn, actually. So there are plenty of people on the CAHOOTS team that themselves have been involved on both the crisis and the EMT side, who have been involved in the mental health services, who've, experienced the whole gamut of types of issues that you might have. And so, yeah, peer support, peer workers are certainly a part of the model, but we don't necessarily, the CAHOOTS team doesn't privilege people who are professionals or have professional certifications over the people who are peers, because the reality is that crisis work, it's very centered around because there are plenty of peers that would be terrible at crisis work, and there are plenty of professionals with licenses that would be terrible at it. It's all about connectivity. It's all about forming immediate, fast, and tight bond with somebody, because you got to realize like this person's in the worst moment of their lives, and they probably really could use somebody who's not going to be patronizing and rude and all that kind of stuff. They just need somebody who's going to listen to them and be nice.
And get down on their level and sit on the ground with them or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've laid on the floor next to somebody who's having a panic attack and just said, let's just rub the carpet together.
Yeah. So in the Eugene model, and we will move on to the other cities that you're working with, but I want to just kind of fully unpack this perfect North Star, I think, for what the whole country is looking at right now. So we talked about you've got someone to call, you've got someone to respond, but now you may have to have some place to take people to. Maybe they need to get off the carpet. Yeah. Are you taking them to an ER? Are you taking them to a psychiatric urgent care? Are you taking them to some other kind of calming place? What are the options?
I think before we even get to that, I do want to make the point that there's a very strong sense that if somebody shows up, you have to take them somewhere, right? And that's not really how the CAHOOTS team operates. The CAHOOTS team really operates around this idea that like the primary goal is basically we're going to do whatever it takes to resolve the issue there. And if once we've kind of exhausted our efforts at that, that's when we're going to transport somebody somewhere else. And I think that that's a different perspective than I think a lot of other crisis teams might have. But then Eugene does have a pretty nice system of transport locations. It just really depends. The CAHOOTS team will transport to what we would refer to as a staffed service. So somebody that we can sort of transfer care to. There's 2 crisis centers, actually, which is nice. Whitebird has one, and then there's another one that county funded. And those are both sort of social, have any medical capabilities. Then there's the psychiatric side to the emergency room in Eugene, which is that's kind of your step up from those. There's a sobering center that was actually opened at the same time that CAHOOTS was started, and they funded them together under the essentially because they wanted the CAHOOTS team to have some place to take people, is very important for a lot of people getting inside when they're intoxicated. Then there's a shelter, and then CAHOOTS has some sort of other types of shelter options at their hands. There's drop-in centers, food. There's a place you can get lunch every day if you're experiencing homelessness or poverty of some kind. And then there's just, for example, you got somebody who lives at a group home because they have developmental issue, delay or whatever, and they end up wandering off downtown. You find them and you like, okay, we'll drive you back to your group home or whatever, that kind of stuff too.
Oh my goodness. We need this so bad in Los Angeles. So let me ask you this. There's been some studies about the outcomes, the positive outcomes that have resulted with a CAHOOTS style approach. I don't know if they were based in Eugene or Springfield, but tell us about the outcomes that actually might speak to policymakers in other cities with respect to cost savings, but also just like quality of life outcomes for the people who are encountering CAHOOTS.
One thing we always say at CAHOOTS is not to be outcome oriented, like don't be attached to it. So if you did your best and you worked really hard and the person still ended up completing suicide or just ending up, doing something that made things worse for them, that's, not your fault. You did the best you could. So we're looking at CAHOOTS is diverting somewhere between, and the Eugene police puts it somewhere between 5 and like 8 or 9% of all police calls. I think that it's probably higher. So I usually say somewhere between 8 and 10% because I think that's about right. So, if you think about that, Eugene, the city's spending just right around $1 million or a little more than $1 million, I think, total on CAHOOTS. So if the Eugene police had to increase their budget by 8%, I mean, that's $4.5 million. So that's $3.5 million they're saving right there. Then the CAHOOTS team does a lot of what we refer to as emergency room diversions. So that's people probably would end up in the emergency room. I actually talked with the Salem Police Department one time, and they said every intoxicated person that they encounter on the Salem Police Department, Salem, Oregon, so a very similar sized city in Oregon, every single person they encounter, they take to the emergency room that's intoxicated. I was just like, oh, man. Sounds like hell. So we, divert those. Those are all emergency room diversions when we can get them someplace else. But you also remember, like, these are also ambulance diversions. These are largely people that are uninsured that would end up in an ambulance and just never pay that bill. They would end up in the emergency room. They never pay that $2,000 bill, so you're looking at, you probably, somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 every time that this doesn't happen. So because of that, the estimate is that the CAHOOTS team is saving sort of the hospitals, the ambulances, and the Medicaid system in Eugene about $8.5 million a year. So you got $1 million, $2 million program total for the whole area. And they're saving over $10 million.
That's pretty impressive.
And they're doing 24,000 calls a year.
And I thought that was important, what you said a few moments ago, that it's not about taking someone somewhere, but maybe a less traumatic way, trying to resolve the situation at the house or at wherever. And that leads to less trauma. And that must, it's hard to put that in some kind of quantifiable term.
Right. And it's hard to quantify, too, stuff that might have happened without that team. So lawsuits and that kind of stuff that might occur. And everyone always asks me, like, what happens when the CAHOOTS team gets sued? And it's like, the CAHOOTS team's never been sued. So I could just describe
the shock on my face right now.
We don't know what's going to happen if the CAHOOTS teams get sued because they've never been sued.
We'll put a pin on that one because I think the risk management specter almost limits our ability to respond in innovative ways in this society. So
that's true.
That's a profound statement. So let's kind of move to, would it be fair to say, I mean, CAHOOTS I had always kind of heard about in our modeling of what they do in Trieste, Italy, where the police are the last people you would call to respond to a mental health crisis. We had already started imagining what it might look like in Hollywood if we could have some kind of alternative response. And CAHOOTS was something we did a little research into. But would it be fair to say that the events of last summer, the hashtag defund the police movement, and just this national kind of reimagining that there must be a better way to handle mental health crises and other crises has jump-started an interest in this type of model?
Oh, big time. Yeah. Oh, big time. I mean, I think Whitebird had within 2 months after George Floyd's death, over 300 requests for some form of response to, talk about the program and what it is and what they do from all around the country. And I do think it is important to note that in terms of the movements to sort of reimagine and redirect funding that goes to the police toward other things, I'd say there's kind of two roads. Definitely the sort of anti-racist, kind of like saying, the history of this institution is a major problem. And as we can point to so many times of excessive force and killing and so on, and that we want to see that stop. And then there's the sort of more sort of mental health, kind of like saying, maybe these aren't the best people to send to these types of calls, and maybe we should find something else different. And I do think that there's certainly overlap, and then there is a little bit of tension between those two roads. And so something to think about, and it's important, I think, for the CAHOOTS model, is that it takes a section, a portion off of the police and the fire and EMS's plate. Right. It's not like I talked to a woman in Culver City. She called me and said, I was under the impression that in Eugene, they had cut the police budget by 50%. The police were responding to next to no calls at all. And that CAHOOTS was taking almost everything. And I was like, yeah, that's not what's happening. And so I do think it's important to dispel some myths and some rumors about this, about CAHOOTS' relationship to the police and sort of how that whole system works, because the Eugene police budget is still, over 50 times what CAHOOTS' budget is. It's not 50% cut. CAHOOTS is not responding to, half the calls there. So that's totally ridiculous. What the CAHOOTS model does is it does sort of take away those types of social service type of calls from the police that they're straight up just not designed to handle. I mean, they're really just not designed to handle those types of calls. The model of policing is not designed for that. It's designed for way different things.
So in California, there's obviously been a lot of movement. And I know you've been talking to it's almost so fortuitous that you went away, Ben Adam, had this experience for 5 years, and now we got you back. So I think
it feels like destiny, I'll be honest.
I'm really so glad you're back. I'm so glad I know you, and I've known you for so long. So let's just talk about Southern California right now in Los Angeles. Preceding the pandemic, preceding all of this, there was what's referred to as the Alternatives to Incarceration initiative. And then kind of adjunct to that is this alternative crisis response. I don't know if it's a task force or whatnot. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think you've had some opportunity to meet with those folks.
There's the county's sort of given a list of, things that they want to see explored, things they want to see changed. And then there's a handful of subcommittees that are actually rooted on what you just talked about and what DMH Director John Sharon says, so there's a subcommittee for call centers, there's a subcommittee for mobile response, and a subcommittee for facilities where you can transport to. And I've been going to those meetings. They're very interesting. I'm cautiously optimistic about them. I'm trying my best to sort of just provide my experience into those. And the thing that I have found very interesting so far is, and this is not unique to LA, is that mostly what we're at now is it's clear that everybody knows what we need. Everybody knows that we need some kind of alternative crisis response. The big question is, okay, who's going to pay for it? And then who's going to operate it? And whose responsibility is that? So I think right now where we're at in terms of alternative crisis response is we're dancing around those questions a little bit. And trying to figure out what it is that it's going to take to sort of get something going.
So let me unpack that for a minute, because I can completely sense the tension that must be happening here. In Los Angeles, you have arguably the largest or second largest county in the country.
It's the largest.
With 88 cities, some of whom contract with the LA Sheriff's Department for their municipal law enforcement. Okay. And some of which have their own municipal law enforcement. And then you have a county department of mental health, which serves the entire county, largest mental health system in the country. And so you're taking a model which has been tried and tested in a small city like Eugene. So that is the North Star. And now imagining carving out funding from law enforcement and maybe even paramedic budgets, because there would be a transfer of response to a mobile alternative crisis team. Is anyone even willing to put their hand in the air and say, we imagine we could cut 20% and, fund this?
I'm laughing because obviously it's no one. Saying that, to complicate it even more, you already have mobile crisis teams in your MET, your MEU/SMART.
Okay, those are all acronyms. Let's tell us what MEU is, MET, SMART, PMRT, the gobbledygook of crisis response right now.
Yeah, the dominant form of crisis response in this country is what is referred to, and most people refer to as co-response, which is to say you pair in some way a licensed clinical social worker, LMFT, psychologist, psychiatrist, nurse practitioner, whatever, with law enforcement officer, and you send them to mental health calls primarily. So in 2,200 cities in the country, that's how they do it. In LA and LA County are really no different. And so what you got MEU/SMART, which are really the same program. That's
acronyms.
LAPDs. It's mental evaluation unit / oh man, you're going to make me remember what SMART
I think it's
stands
something
for.
mobile access response team, something mobile.
Super mobile
access response team.
Assessment required.
We'll put that in the episode notes and we'll get it right.
Yeah, and then I can't remember what SMART stands for. And then you've got your MET teams, which are LA sheriffs, and then also a batch of different municipal police departments have MET teams.
And there's PMRT.
So then there's PMRT, which is not co-response. That is Psychiatric Mobile Response Team. And that is a 2-clinician team, which goes to these types of calls, usually without police, although they do call for police assistance on a pretty regular basis. PMRT is interesting. They go out to these calls, and 33% of the time they end up putting somebody on a 5150 or an involuntary hold. I'm not too familiar with how many calls they take a year, although I know it's a fair amount. And they are countywide. So they respond to you irrespective of what city you're in.
And they're 24-hour?
No, they're not. They are 18 or maybe 20 hours a day. They're close to 24 hours, but not quite. But they don't do their own transports. So they cannot transport people. So if they decide that they're going to put a hold on you, then they call for a private ambulance company who then comes out and does the transport to a very limited amount of locations. So if you want to compare and contrast that to CAHOOTS team does their own transports, and they can transport you pretty much anywhere that you want to go as long as there's somebody to receive you at that
Even
point.
to home.
Yeah, the CAHOOTS team doesn't transport home unless there is like somebody. Generally, we're not technically allowed to transport home, but like for youth, for example, where their parents are there, then make some exceptions around that. Or if your home is a group home or permanent supportive housing location with somebody who's on site, something like that, the staff on site. And then the CAHOOTS team does taxi people from time to time when you're just trying to get home, and then similarly compare and contrast to sort of MEU and MET. I think it's pretty obvious the differences. I mean, the CAHOOTS team has a medical component. So if there's something going on with that, you don't have to call for the fire department and EMS to come out and help. You don't get a police officer most of the time. I mean, vast majority of the time, you're not going to get any cops at all for when you call for CAHOOTS, even if you're suicidal. So with MET and MEU or SMART, you're always getting a cop. And then the flexibility of it. It's just such a more agile model. Those teams that I just mentioned, MEU, SMART, it's all very well-intentioned, right? I mean, it's all very well-intentioned. So I don't want to knock them for trying. But just to make a point, so you've got 4 million people in LA. The METs from the sheriffs, they service 2.5 million people. And between those two teams, LAPD's MEU SMART team and LASD's MET team, they took in 2019, I think, they took right around 15,000 calls.
And I think you said 24,000 you took in Eugene, Oregon.
Yeah, so we're talking about a population of 6.5 million people, and they took 15,000 calls. Eugene and Springfield, we're talking 230,000 people, and they took between 24 and 30,000 calls for the year. So almost double.
This is really a fascinating enigma that you're in the midst of right now, Ben Adam. Let me ask you this question. The Whitebird Clinic in Eugene is a nonprofit organization.
Yeah.
So obviously the city and or the county contracts with the nonprofit. Is there any discussion as people are imagining this in Southern California of contracting with a nonprofit or multiple nonprofits, perhaps?
The irony of all this progressive Los Angeles County and all the cool things we have here, they are going to get smoked in terms of the development of these types of programs by Orange County, who in the city of Huntington Beach, as a city that I'm working with, they are developing a CAHOOTS style program that are going to contract with a nonprofit called Be Well. And that is up and coming. And we'll probably have our first team on the road there responding, I think, at least by the middle of summer.
So what are the cities that perhaps you are actively aware of or even working with in California?
Well, in Southern California, it's Huntington Beach. And then I've done a lot of advising to cities in the area on a sort of informal basis. including West Hollywood, Culver City, a little bit of Claremont, and just some other places that are kind of interested. And then in Northern California, I'm working with a city called Petaluma, next to Petaluma called Roanoke Park, and a small town called Cotati, which are right next to each other. And then I'm going to sign a contract with the city of Vallejo probably later today or tomorrow.
So maybe some of these smaller cities can start to kind of pave the way on how to do this. Given that you have 5 years experience in the trenches doing this in Eugene, and now you're coming up against kind of like a pretty established bureaucracy with unions and people who have gone to graduate school to get those extra letters after their name because assume that that's going to afford them some special status. I saw an article you wrote, I think it was in Psychiatric Times, that it's counterintuitive. Who are the best folks to do this work?
Yeah.
If you were to describe the classic staffing scenario and how it maybe contrasts with how we're staffing this now, what are we up against?
And again, like I said, we don't care if you have your LCSW. In fact, the best CAHOOTS worker to ever live is this woman named Laurel, and she's the current CAHOOTS program coordinator. She's an LCSW. She's amazing. She's incredible. But we also have people on the CAHOOTS team that never got their high school diplomas. And honestly, it's actually sort of surprising how many people on the CAHOOTS team got kicked out of high school. And maybe the kind of rogue tendency sort of attracts people to CAHOOTS. But the CAHOOTS team, we love people who are able to have that almost customer service like skill. We always like to hire people who've worked at coffee shops or like bars, like bartenders, because they're so skilled at, and bartending and crisis counseling are basically the same job. They're so skilled at listening and just connecting with you. And so much of pretty much all of crisis work is, can you walk into the room and can you basically become that person's best friend in 2 to 3 minutes? And if you can do that, you'll be really good at it. And you don't have to have letters behind your name to be able to do that. And after you're able to do that, we'll teach you all the little nuancy stuff. Okay, well, these are the questions you got to ask to really get through a suicide assessment. Well, first of all, you can't even get to that suicide assessment well, right? You can't expect that person to even tell you what they're really feeling unless you're able to do that first part. That first very difficult step of really connecting to that person. Because if you can't connect to that person and then you ask them, do you feel like killing yourself? Do you, what's blah, blah, blah? Do you have plans for tomorrow? Blah, blah, blah. These questions, no one's going to tell you the truth. And if they do, then I guess they're really in a bad spot. But it's like, they're not going to tell you the truth. So then you end up distrusting them, right? And you end up distrusting them, not because of them, but because you couldn't do it correctly, and you couldn't connect with them. And that, and they know that, and people know that. And so, the really center around it is that connection, is being able to form a human connection with the person and do it well and do it quickly and do it with anyone.
So that does beg the question, were there time limits placed on your expectation in Eugene that, oh my gosh, you've been with this person now for 3 hours. It's not cost effective. You need to move on.
No.
Okay.
No.
I didn't think so.
No way. Because that's just, no. Because that person needs to feel like, I mean, obviously, if we're there for an hour and a half and we've talked about the same thing 17 times in a row for the last 40 minutes, we're going to be like, okay, we got to go. But, if we're working through that whole process and it takes us 3 hours, usually it doesn't take that long. But the ones that really do end up taking that long are like family disputes where you've got 5 people and the parents are screaming at the teenagers and the teenagers are all screaming at each other and everyone's fighting each other and everyone's pissed off. And one of them's yelling, oh, you don't have to worry about it because I'll be dead tomorrow. That kind of stuff. Like those calls take hours. By and large, we don't put time limits on it.
So I always like to try to get one personal story out of a conversation like this. So Ben Adam, you worked for 5 years right in the trenches in Hollywood, working with seriously mentally ill people and trying to do what you can within the constraints of our system to help them. And then you moved to Eugene, and now you've got this kind of liberated, high discretion, high human contact opportunity. And now you're back. Can you tell a story about something maybe you were able to do in Eugene that would have gone a whole different direction in Hollywood?
Oh, I think the story that I like to tell best, and I think so I'll just change some of the details a little bit here. So we got called out to a suicidal call, and the police were already on scene because the involved person, that's a little bit of radio lingo there, the involved person had a very dangerous weapon. And they had put themselves into a space where it was not safe for anyone to enter. Let's just put it that way. Figure out what to do. And I ended up sitting next to the door where they were for probably between 45 minutes to an hour, just talking with them and saying, makes a lot of sense the way you're feeling. You've been through a lot of hard stuff. And I'm not saying I understand, because I don't, because I've never been in the sort of situation you've been in. But it does make sense that what you're feeling is so overwhelming, and that you feel like the only way out of this is what you're sort of saying that you think is the only way out. And after, 45 minutes or so, they finally decided to come out. And they came out and they got kind of mad at me because they were like, oh, you tricked me, because the police were still there. And I was like, you knew the cops were here. And they're not going to let you hold on to that weapon. That's ridiculous. Like, no one wants you to hold on to it. Put it down, don't think that I didn't trick you. And they were like, okay, you're right. And so then, we went and we all sat down in an open space room and we had a really good, productive conversation. And then we all left.
Wow. That's a great story. And I can see you doing that also. That's your gift. That is your gift. You mentioned to me that there's federal legislation now pending. It's in the American Rescue Plan. You actually sent it to me, but I couldn't find it in there. So I'm going to let you tell us about the significance of this, how it is that potential funding for CAHOOTS style programs have been included in, I guess it's called HR 1319. It has an origin story with your senator in Oregon. What's important for us to know about this?
Well, yeah, it will fund essentially CAHOOTS style programs, so multidisciplinary teams that are responding sort of in lieu of police officers and paramedics and stuff, going out to crisis calls of some sort with a Medicaid matching grant, I think up to $1 billion, and then states have to opt into it. So I'm positive that there are going to be some states out there that are like, we don't want that won't opt in. I'm sure California will. And it'll fund 85%. It's not totally clear on what the details are going to be like, on how that funding is going to work. I've gotten a lot of mixed understandings of it from people. So some people understand it that it's 85% payment only when you respond to Medicaid recipients. Others have told me that that's not how it's going to work, that actually it's going to be block grants. So you pay, let's say that the program's $1 million. Federal government pays $850,000 of it. You pay $150,000 of it. Not totally clear if that's actually how it's going to work. And then the other question is like, will the state of California will sort of make some determinations on how they're going to distribute those funds. But the reality is that this money is going to be coming out. $1 billion is a lot of money, obviously, and it's designed specifically for teams that are based on the CAHOOTS model. So multidisciplinary and responding to mental health calls. And it was introduced by Ron Wyden, he's been a senator in Oregon since I was a kid, almost 30 years, I think. He's been around, and his brother died living on the street, experiencing psychosis and I think some substance use issues and things like that. So he's very interested in finding ways to have people responding to people like his brother in different ways.
So as we wind down, I would like you to kind of have the final word. We've got people listening to this podcast who are involved in policy, who are envisioning how to design these programs in small jurisdictions, large, etc. Again, what are like the 3 things you want them to really think about? These are like 3 non-negotiables if you're really going to try to do alternative crisis response in a way that is going to be effective and human. What are the 3 things you want to hold near and dear?
I think the first thing is don't get sidelined by what may appear to be big things. So what I mean by that is don't get sidelined by the demand that these only be staffed by licensed clinical social workers and that kind of stuff. I have no problem with people who are licensed clinical social workers, but the crisis response is so different than the process, the difficult, arduous process of doing therapy with somebody, which does take a lot of distinct and unique and training, I think, in comparison to crisis work, which it takes a lot of training, but it also takes that specific, unique sort of personality trait. So don't get hung up on that stuff. The other big thing not to get hung up on is this, I run into this everywhere, which is, well, yeah, but, does this team, 5150 people? Right. And this sort of...
Can they write a hold?
Right. Can they write a hold? And this fixation that if you have a mobile crisis response team, they have to be able to do that. And it's like, look, there are so many things going on in the vast realm of human emotional experience that causes crises that in no way, shape, or form mandate that you write a hold on them. So many, so much. It's unbelievable, how many things people experience. They just need support. Let's focus on that big thing, that wide array of human emotion, rather than that one small part of it that is, when do we write a 5150 on someone? So I would say, focus on that. Focus on responding to that big piece of human experience rather than getting stuck on that other small piece of human experience, which is the modern convention of putting involuntary holds on people. That's the biggest thing, I think. Don't get hung up on that stuff. I think 2 is listen to especially if you're an elected official, listen to your constituents. I find it very hard to believe that anybody doesn't want this, because I talk to conservatives, liberals, radicals. This is one of the few things that everyone agrees on. We would love to have some kind of non-law enforcement mental health response system. That's what everyone is saying. There's very, very little debate over that. And so I say, listen to your constituents and just hear them out, and listen to your neighbors and listen to everybody else, because everyone is saying this. They want it now. And we need to be thorough and thoughtful about it. We also can't waste time. And I think that finally, I will use the words of Chris Skinner, the Eugene chief of police, which is, you are not going to want to be 5 years down the road and wish that you hadn't done this. And it was a presentation I did with him with City Council member Blumenfield. And he said, got to do it. And he said, I used to work as a chief in Washington State in a city without a CAHOOTS style program. And I will tell you, I had no idea. I had no idea how awesome that program is. If it comes 5 years from now and people are still asking you for this and you're still just humming and hawing, you're going to wish you hadn't. You're going to wish you had done it now. So do it now.
Do it now. That is a great way to end this. I'm so excited that you're here in Southern California helping people find their way on this very, very important topic. And, we're coming into an election year next year in Los Angeles, new mayor, half the city council, a couple county supervisors. So it is important that they pay heed, because this is front and center on the public's conscience right now.
Yeah.
I will tell everybody that in the episode notes, we will link information on how to connect with you. Got some articles you've written, and that will be a way for people to follow up with you if they want to confer in any way. And just can't thank you enough for giving up part of your morning this morning, Ben Adam.
Thank you. No, this is awesome. That was really, really fun. And this is my vision for the future is that there will be a time where no matter what city you're in, you will know that you can call for a police officer if someone's attacking you, or being violent, a firefighter if there's a fire, a paramedic if you had a heart attack or if you're in an accident, and a CAHOOTS style mobile crisis team if somebody your love is intoxicated, if you're having a mental health issue, if you're suicidal. It doesn't matter what city you're in, that you learn that from childhood onward, and that's what will be understood. And that's my dream. That's my vision. That
is a great vision. Thank you, Ben Adam. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
What I loved about this interview with Ben Adam is his description of what it takes to be successful as a crisis worker on a mobile response team. It boils down to this. Can you walk into a room and can you basically become that person's best friend in 2 to 3 minutes? I think you can hear from Ben Adam's voice and demeanor that he has a heart for this work. And I applaud the local officials who are paying careful attention to his advice as they consider how to approach a new crisis response paradigm in their communities. Next week, we are uploading the full panel discussion of a gathering that might have actually been almost impossible to organize except for the power of Zoom. Please listen in to hear multiple voices discuss how an innovative program was piloted at LA County Twin Towers, one of the largest institutions caring for mentally ill inmates in the country. We will transform this Zoom panel into a podcast which features the Assistant Sheriff for Custody in LA County, the Director of Jail Mental Health Programs, 2 academic researchers, and most important, 2 inmates facing extended prison terms who are serving as mental health assistants in the LA County Jail. Thank you to my partners at Peer Mental Health who collaborate in the production of this podcast, And thank you from the bottom of my heart to my technical editor, Paul Robinson. See you next week.